for me, I'm good at PR. Like that is what I'm good at. So that wasn't the issue. But being a business person is completely different. Just the fact that you have to run your own books, like your accounting. Um, you have to make sure that you have processes in place because when you're dealing with these clients, that's what they expect. And I feel like the hardest part for me was making sure that, and also like to your point, this is my own business. And this was my first time delving into this. So I knew some things from working from the agency, and I tried to emulate that as far as pulling together proposals for my clients and things like that. But truthfully, it was a learning process. It was really a work in process. Like I learned as I went.
Being in the Baltimore and DC area, a lot of media members have a certain closeness because it's a chance that you'll either cover the Baltimore teams or the Washington teams. My next guest is a sports journalist who also has her own PR business. But the time we met was actually at a Washington football team's game at the end of the season, their last game of the season. I was doing my work with Fox Sports and she was covering the game. Now, we had been following each other on social media because, that's what journalists do. We follow each other. But it was really cool to get a chance to meet in person. And we've been trying to get this interview done since last year, end of December. But we finally getting it done. So, ladies and gentlemen, here is my guest, Miss Carita Parks. Ladies and gentlemen, on this episode of Breaking Through Glass Ceilings, I have communications strategist, PR maven, and sports journalist, Miss Carita Parks. Miss Parks, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I appreciate you taking time out your busy schedule to come on the show. Unfortunately, we're still in the midst of two pandemics. So before we get started, I have to ask, how are you doing as we're in the midst of a racial pandemic, which we've been dealing with all our lives, obviously, but is also COVID-19?
I'll say I'm doing well considering the circumstances. I like to have my benchmark as long as I have a roof over my head and I can still pay my bills, because some people are not as fortunate. So that's essentially my benchmark. But it's been a very trying and interesting time altogether, though, especially as you mentioned with the racial and the social injustice. It feels like maybe because we are in this pandemic and we're dealing with COVID, and then you add that on top of it, and I think people are having an opportunity to actually pay more attention to it because we had to slow down. It's a bit more emotionally taxing. It always has been, like you said, like we've been dealing with this, but especially at a time like this, it's definitely been kind of trying from that perspective, but otherwise, I've been able to find ways to keep myself busy, stay safe, wash my hands, social distance, all of that.
Yeah, well, that's good. I definitely appreciate that. As we recording, I was in the bank earlier today, and there was, I'm just say, a white man sitting up there fussing with the white lady and the black lady who were employees of the bank because he didn't want to pull his mask up. And he was like, F off, lady. And I'm like, first of all, your mother's right there.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was like, they're stupid idiots. And all she said was, well, they probably think the same thing about you. But I'm like, it's the policy. It's the same thing as if you try to walk in there without a shirt or without shoes. They're going to tell you, put a shirt, put shoes on. That's where we are with masks today. And he was just being difficult for no reason.
I don't really understand why people are so upset about the fact that they have to wear a mask. It's really, in my opinion, not that serious. And if it keeps us safe and can get us back to a sense of normalcy at some point, because it's still going to take a while, I don't see the reason why you just can't wear your mask. Literally, it's if you're in a store, which typically you're really not in the store for more than an hour, just wear your mask.
That's it. Just wear your freaking mask, people, and wash your hands. But to lighter notes, let's talk about you. Um, when did you decide that you wanted to pursue a career in communications?
Oh, I knew that from such a young age. I don't think at that point I knew what it was called, but my skill set was always communications. I would write scripts when I was younger because I used to watch the news a lot. The news wasn't as heavy as it is now back in the day. So I would watch the news and just create my own news scripts. And as time went on, I felt like I wanted to be in broadcast journalism. And as I got older and I went to college, that was under the umbrella of communications. But at that point, I realized, okay, this broadcast journalism may not pay the bills the way that I needed to pay my bills. And so I was just thinking, well, what other career can I have that will allow me to use my variety of skill sets from writing? I was into media. And that's when I ended up pivoting to public relations. And so I decided in college that I was going to go down the path of pursuing PR. My degree was still communications. And like I said, broadcast journalism also fell under that umbrella. But I knew from a very young age that was my path, essentially.
Okay. Now, what was it about PR that made you want to go down that path? You look at communications, it's a wide open field. You got audio, you got production, but ultimately you chose public relations. What was it about PR?
For me, I knew I wanted to do sports PR. That's kind of where I started. I wanted to help athletes or sports organizations build their brand. But also with PR, there's just so many facets to it. I was always really good at writing. So I was very intrigued by the fact that there was a lot of writing involved because people see PR now and they think of like the glitz and glamour, the red carpets. And yes, that exists. But a lot of PR, we have to write news releases, we have to write speeches depending on which realm you're in. We have to write talking points for our clients. So there's a lot of writing newsletters if you work for an organization. So there's a lot of that involved. And then I also like the aspect of being able to work with different members of the media and different journalists. And PR for me, there was just so much that you could do. I wanted to do sports, but there's a lot that you can do in PR besides sports. So I felt like it was a very broad field and it just matched what I wanted to accomplish in the future.
Oh, okay. So what would you say for those who are trying to figure it out right now? Can you explain the difference between PR writing and journalism writing, which we'll get into your journalist background in a bit, but could you like kind of give a preview by explaining the difference in writing for those two different audiences?
I like to say it goes a little bit hand in hand because you still have to be creative. But when it comes to PR writing, you're a little bit more matter of fact and straight to the point, depending upon what you're writing for. So if you're writing a press release, you just want to get those facts out there. But just like in journalism, you still have to find a niche or a piece of that story that you're trying to sell to get that journalist interested in what you're pitching them. And I feel like it's the same thing even on the journalism side. Like you have to write something that fans or people reading your work are going to gravitate towards. So there's not huge differences in that sense. I also think even with PR writing, if you're writing a newsletter or something of that nature, like you still have to be creative. And so there might be a little bit more creativity involved in PR writing, but I think even in journalism, that's a fact as well.
Okay. Now you got more on the business side before you got into sports, right?
You're right.
As far as in the PR field. Can you talk about working in corporate America, even though you still had that itch to be in sports?
So when I got out of college, my first job actually was with the First Tee, which is associated with the World Golf Foundation in St. Augustine, Florida. So I did work for a sports organization first. And then my career path, I would decide to go back to get my MBA. And when I went and got my MBA, I was offered a job at an agency. And I was always told that as a communicator, working at an agency, it's a good look because it gives you a ton of different experience and you have an opportunity to work with all kinds of different organizations. And then that's when I feel like I really got kind of stuck in that corporate realm. But it's definitely not as flashy as working in sports is. But working in corporate, it was still cool because I worked on so many different projects where I still had an opportunity to, depending upon what it is. So I'll give you an example. I worked with the Environmental Protection Agency on a project that was going on in Jacksonville, Florida. And that sounds really dry and boring, right? When you just hear it offhand. But we were able to brand that project. I worked a lot with the community and got to know a lot of members of the community, which is also very gratifying. And I worked with the mayor's office. So I met like a lot of people and had an opportunity to still be creative. But working in corporate is definitely different because there's a lot more rules, a lot more restrictions. And it's not, depending upon what you're doing, it's not as public as when you're working with the athlete, because that right there, if an athlete does something wrong and you're working in PR, that can go viral. And unless you're working for a huge corporation, if something goes wrong within the organization, you can usually essentially minimize that.
Okay. So then you created your own agency, right? Parks Public Relations.
Mm-hmm.
When did you decide that that was something you wanted to do? I've noticed, so, I've worked, I PR was the last thing I ever thought I would do. When I was in college at Morgan State, I was television production. Then the next thing was journalism. And journalism was kind of like my first love, but I wanted to learn how to produce. Then, I took a radio class to learn audio. Never took a PR class. And now I work at Johns Hopkins in media relations. And I remember, like, how the heck did I get here? Other than
Life could
shout
take
out,
you on some interesting paths, that's for
yeah, exactly, and shout out to the boss group for placing me there. But it was really because of my social media background.
sure.
But I learned during my time there. A few of my colleagues have worked at agencies, but then I met people who have their own PR firms and PR agencies. Can you talk about when did you realize it was time for you to create your own, and how you went about it, and how you've been able to leverage your skill set to build your clientele?
I decided to start my own business when I was working at the agency, for two reasons. One, I still had a love for sports, but as we just alluded to, I was working in more of a corporate realm. So I wanted to build my own company where I had an opportunity to still do sports and pursue that sports PR path that I wanted to originally. But I still needed to work at that particular time. And the other reason that I started it while I was at the agency is because it was a very small business and I was working for a woman who actually she created that company and she built it up. So I was able to see that and kind of get a little bit of exposure to entrepreneurship. And then in addition to that, when you work for an agency, you do have to have an entrepreneurial spirit because you may be working with different clients, doing a variety of different things for each client, and you have to juggle that. And it's almost like each client is its own little business, so to speak. And then you're still responsible for helping bring in new business for the agency. So all of that I feel prepped me for the ability to open my own company. And I really felt like at that point, I can do this. So I actually was in Jacksonville, Florida at that time, and I ended up moving to DC. And I felt like when I moved to DC, it was a good time to make that move. I was getting a fresh start. And so I went about essentially pursuing my LLC. I started Parks PR, had a little bit of a business plan, but for me, it was just like, you can do this, go ahead and do it. And I got my first client through word of mouth. And from there, it seemed like every client that I worked with ended up referring me to someone else and referring me to someone else. And my business essentially grew.
Wow.
Now, you asked me something else. I don't know if I answered all of your questions.
No, you did, and I
Okay.
was gonna follow up. Can you talk about the process of landing your first client, and eventually, trying to essentially build that trust? Because it's like I, coming from a sales background. I remember I used to sell cars, and that first, obviously, like, I sold my first car. I was 19 when I did it for 6 months. I mean 18, and
Okay.
I remember working there. It was like, man, well, if I'd have knew this when I did my first deal, it would have been different. But when you're trying to get that first client in sales, it's always hard. But then once you get it, you're like, all right, I'm here now. So can you talk about what it was like for you to land that first client? This is your business. This isn't anybody else. There's nobody else that's going to step in if you mess up the deal and save the day for the company. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I landed my first client. I was at a networking event and I ended up building a relationship with this young man who was starting an education program that used music, like rap music, to teach literacy. And for me, I'm good at PR. Like, that is what I'm good at. So that wasn't the issue. But being a business person is completely different. Just the fact that you have to run your own books, like your accounting. Um, you have to make sure that you have processes in place, because when you're dealing with these clients, that's what they expect. And I feel like the hardest part for me was making sure that, and also, like, to your point, this is my own business. And this was my first time delving into this. So I knew some things from working from the agency, and I tried to emulate that as far as pulling together proposals for my clients and things like that. But truthfully, it was a learning process. It was really a work in process. Like, I learned as I went when it came to building my relationship with my first client. Now, luckily, from a trust perspective, I was able to build that trust because I was getting results.
Mhm.
I was getting him media attention. I was helping him grow his brand. So I was doing that. And so therefore he did trust me, but I feel like my biggest challenge was learning how to run the business.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So was he influential in it? Was he one who started passing the word to help your business increase, or was it just attending more networking events, or how did that happen?
It was a little bit of both. My next client came from work from him, actually, and it was a pretty major client. I ended up working with the Bottom Line Sports Show, which was produced by Penny Hardaway.
Okay.
And so I had an opportunity to work with Penny, and my first assignment with them, they were having a Little Penny. I don't know if I hopefully people remember Little Penny listening, but I don't know.
Yep.
Okay, good. So they
Well,
were
hopefully the
having
people listening remember.
right, I know. Well, if you don't know, look it up, because Little Penny was big at one point.
Yeah, sure was.
But they were having a reunion with him and Chris Rock. And so my job was to promote that and get them some media coverage, which I did successfully. So the word of mouth came from him originally to get my second client. But when it came to getting my other clients, it was also networking events and social media. People I don't know if people realize how influential social media can be. I was just putting the things that I was doing out there. And the funny thing is, sometimes people never like what you're like, they never press the like button. So, but they see you. And I would have people reach out to me like, hey, I know you do PR. I have this going on. And so it came from social media, networking, and word of mouth.
So did you have to deal with the fluff of, people from high school who may not have, you know, talked to you, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, remember me? Remember the time I bought you lunch, knowing they lying?
I feel like I deal with that. I didn't deal with it as much with PR. I deal with that a little bit more now from the journalism perspective
Mm-hmm.
because I'm very active in that realm. And I was active in PR too, but I think like knowing what I did in PR and now seeing what I'm doing in journalism, it's like everybody wants to be my friend now. But I'm like, okay, if I wasn't doing this, would it still be the same situation? I don't know.
Yeah, I tell you, that's another topic conversation we'll have to get into. But before, so now let's talk about the switch though, or I should say, in your case, bringing the worlds together, sort of. When did you decide to jump into freelancing as a sports journalist? When did you, I guess, say to yourself like, I wanted to do this, let's go do it?
So it's interesting. I got introduced to journalism again because remember when I was younger, I wanted to do broadcast journalism, and then I just completely went down a different path.
Mm-hmm.
But I got back to journalism through PR. I had a client, I was doing a lot of PR work for them, specifically for a couple of Super Bowls. One Super Bowl, which was in Phoenix, they had a couple of events, so I went out there and I was doing my PR work. But in that, I got to attend other events.
Now
And one of those,
we sports fans. You're gonna have to tell us who was playing in the Super Bowl that year.
oh, that was Seattle, the Seattle Seahawks, and the New England Patriots.
I shouldn't have
It's
asked.
always the Patriots. Every Super Bowl that I've had an opportunity to attend, it's been the Patriots. It's been another team on the
Uh-huh.
NFC side.
Funny
Last
story.
year was the first Super Bowl I went to, and it was New England free,
Wow.
which was nice.
That Super Bowl you just named, that was the day after my daughter was born.
Oh,
And this when I was working at ESPN. And the doctor told us, because there was a blizzard coming, they said, okay, if she's healthy, y'all go home tomorrow. I said, all right, cool. I'm gonna get to watch the Super Bowl in the house.
look at you thinking about the Super Bowl.
Look, well, and I had told my producer, this one, there was Mike and Mike. I was working on a show. I said, if I said, my wife is supposed to get her labor induced on Friday, so we should be home by Sunday. I'll come to work Monday, but then I'm gonna take my, the next 9 days off. Well, my daughter was stubborn. She didn't even want to come yet, but she came the day before the game. But they told us we'd go home. And I remember watching, me and my son was watching the game. And then when that play happened, I'm a Ravens fan, so I have deep-rooted disdain for the New England Patriots. Maybe not so much now because Cam's there.
Yeah,
But it was one of those things like, ugh. And I had a few friends who went to the game, and I was just like, this is horrible.
that was that.
Where were you when that happened? Wait, you remember where you was?
Yes, I was in Phoenix,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a friend from college who actually lived in Phoenix, and I went to his Super Bowl party.
Okay.
And so I was there with like a bunch of other people, and it was actually some Seahawk fans and some Patriots fans, especially
Mm-hmm.
because Phoenix is closer to the West Coast. And I remember I was standing in the living room. I was feeling real good about that game. And then that play happened, and I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it.
But that
I
was your
still to
that
this
was
day, that was Seattle Super Bowl. I don't care what nobody says.
yeah, that was your first Super Bowl?
That was my first. I actually went to the Super Bowl the year before.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm sorry, I'm getting it mixed up. No, the year before was, I think, in New York, I believe.
Yep, it was MetLife because it was the Seahawks Broncos. That was the first Super Bowl that I actually got to like cut a quick highlight for. So I remember that one.
So yeah, that was my first Super Bowl, but I wasn't as active there.
Okay.
So Phoenix was really my first good experience with a Super Bowl. And so in doing those events, I was able to just check out some of the media availabilities that were going on. And I was at the Seahawks media availability, and I was hanging out with some of the reporters because the client that I had was actually a sports blog
Okay.
that covered different, mostly football, but they covered all the major events. And so I was hanging out with some of the reporters, and I had a colleague who was just like, why don't you sit down and interview one of the players? And at that point, my mind wasn't even at all in that place because I'm there for PR. So I was kind of thrown off, but I ended up doing it. And at that point, I was just like, I'm really good at this, actually. I'm connecting with the player very well. I do know what I'm talking about because I was still into sports.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I had a sports PR business. So at that point, I ended up speaking to the owner of the company and letting her know that I had an interest in doing some writing for her. And she was very open to it because she already knew I was a good writer. I wasn't writing from a journalism perspective when it came to her, but I was doing a lot of PR writing.
Mm-hmm.
So she already knew I was a good writer and had a lot of faith from that standpoint. But she was very open to it. And the funny thing is the PR work kind of subsided anyway. So I ended up just focusing more on the journalism. And the first event she sent me to was the NFL draft. And that kind of just throws you right into the fire.
Yeah.
Like you have to be on it immediately. And ever since then, the rest is history.
Now, for people who don't know, can you explain the difference between essentially being a publicist and being an agent? When the show that airs before this one is an episode with my friend Anthony Johnson, the agent of the Renaissance Sports Group. And he's a certified NBA agent. You doing PR, can you explain the difference for those who do not know?
Yeah, the agent, I like to think of the agent as the athlete's like career manager, like their overall career manager. I mean, if you look at Deshaun Watson and Jalen Ramsey, like they just signed big deals. I mean, that's a really good example of part of what an agent does is they negotiate those deals. But from the PR perspective, I'm specifically just responsible for managing that athlete's brand. And sometimes agents are involved in that too. I mean, some agents, they want to be involved with that and they are a part of that. But I'm essentially responsible for managing the public image of an athlete. So that's everything from media training, securing media placements, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and now I've been doing that for doctors, which is interesting.
That's very different, yeah.
But fortunately, the ones that's on my side have been really, really cool. I have to ask you this question: Netflix, strong black lead, just blessed us with so many shows that we grew up watching. So when you brought up managing the athlete's public image, it took me back to Dion in The Game.
Yes.
Earlier.
Oh, yeah. I forget, but for The Game, I can't remember. Was she an agent?
She was the publicist.
Okay.
She was Derwin's publicist. And
I didn't remember that she was the publicist. Okay.
Yeah. So I had to ask, have you ever had any situations, and you can decline the answer, where you had to, really help your client look better, as opposed, because him or his girlfriend may have had some issues, so you have to restore their public images.
I honestly have been lucky enough not to be in a situation where I've had someone whose image really needed a lot of repair. I've
Mhm.
been lucky enough to be in a place where they've been fairly neutral and they just need more help with like building their image and
Okay.
building their brand. But I mean, that's kind of similar to what we call like, or this,
Mhm.
like crisis
Yeah.
communication. Like with the athlete is different. Crises are different with athletes.
Woo.
But luckily, I've been able to stay out of that. The funny thing is, the crises happen more for me on the corporate side, but
Hmm.
I've just been lucky because, as you know, like athletes can be a handful.
Yeah. Oh, so can doctors.
Yeah, yeah,
I,
I mean,
I,
truthfully, actually, you're right because athletes you just see more of what they do. But
hmm.
you're right. I mean, I've worked with some CEOs
Oh yeah.
and some entrepreneurs who are just
Never been told
legitimately
no, and they think that you supposed to. And shout out to
work
you
magic.
being a black woman in the business, because you know I can imagine that could be tough. I could, it's my show. Some people from my job listen to it, some of them don't. But I'll go ahead and say it. I work with a lot of great women on my team, but I've seen how some of these egotistical doctors will, try to have like, no, you guys need to make this happen, this, that, and the other. And I haven't had a lot of those issues, but I'm always like, kind of like, no, I got to talk to my manager. I'm gonna make you respect them as much as I can.
Mhm.
But yeah, I was watching it. Now, when the Antonio Brown stuff happened, in your mind, did you put on your publicist hat and say, I could have did this and make this better? Or were people like him, you just say, look, I'm glad I don't have to deal with that?
At this point, I'm just like, I'm glad I don't have to deal with that. but when it comes to, but when it comes to other athletes situations all the time, it's like I naturally have my PR hat on. I can't help it. Even when I am in the journalism mode, it's like my
Mhm.
PR hat is still on and I'm always able to pick up on things that I'm sure other reporters aren't picking up on who aren't in the business. So that PR hat is definitely stays on, especially when I see other situations. I mean, at this point, Antonio Brown's just done so
I
much.
don't want him on my Ravens. Some people here saying, let's get him. No, he needs to stay
No,
where he's at. There's, at the time, probably by the time this airs, OBJ may or may not be traded. People will talk about him. I'm not really sure. I want him. I kind of think he's overrated. So, I got you on here. I got to ask you a sports question. You're a sports journalist, a sports specialist. Let's just call it that.
I like that.
Yeah, OBJ, Odell Beckham Jr. I personally think he's overrated. I think his best days are behind him. What do you think?
I would have to agree. I think his best days are behind him because ever since he's left the Giants, OBJ hasn't done much. So we'll see what happens as he moves forward. But as of now, I'm gonna have to say his best days are behind him. That's what it appears to be.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here looking at everything. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. But how is it? So one of the things I like what you said was, by you being able to have the PR background, and then when you go in as a journalist to these games and these events, you can see things from a different standpoint. Do you think this allows you to build better relationships with the players and the team, because they understand, like, once they get to know you, that they can trust you and that you're trying to tell the story, but you're not purposely trying to make them look bad?
Absolutely. And what you just said is key there. Because I do have that PR lens, my line of questioning is typically a lot different from the other reporters. Like, yes, if we're in a game situation, I'm going to ask questions about the game. But outside of that, when I have opportunities to ask other questions, I think they don't know I'm in PR, like the athletes, but I do think that they can automatically tell that my line of questioning is different. And I just try to think about it from the standpoint of what would they want people to know about them? And I think that's where that PR comes in. Just try to put them in the best light because, sometimes you have people who want to spin a story or exaggerate a story. They get enough of that. So I'm trying to bring something different to the table, but I definitely think having that PR background has benefited me from that perspective.
Yeah. Um, so can you tell us about your new venture, your new sports platform, and that being Double Take Sports?
Yeah, I'm excited about that. So Parks PR has been around about 10 years now, and I feel like that's very established. People know that. So I was ready to move on to adding a new venture, Double Take Sports, and I was really inspired to do that, kind of what we just talked about. I feel like there's so many stories out there that are untapped, and I also believe that I'm able to see different angles and perspectives on things, especially like having that business background. I can look at sports from a business perspective. I can look at sports from a human perspective, but then I can also look at it from the analysis side too. So I wanted to create this platform as an opportunity to bring some of those stories that don't necessarily get talked about a lot to light and just show a different side of not just athletes, but just different sports stories in general.
You have a favorite story you've been working on?
Favorite story. So, a favorite story that I've been working on is actually probably coming up. I need to finish it. But because I started off in golf, I'm very passionate about showcasing minority golfers and just telling more of those stories because there's that myth that Black people or minorities aren't really into golf, and I found out that that's completely untrue. When I was working at the First Tee, you don't necessarily see them like in the Tiger Woods light, but a lot of them are teaching these young kids how to golf and how to be golf pros. So I'm working on a story of showcasing a friend of mine who I know from back in when I used to work at First Tee. He was actually an intern, but showcasing some work that he's doing on Capitol Hill to help diversify golf. So that'll be coming out soon. And another story that I actually didn't work on, but a friend of mine just wrote with Dak Prescott putting out there that he was dealing with depression issues.
Mm-hmm.
I have a friend who that really resonated with him, especially when Skip Bayless tried to call Dak weak because he put that in public. So he just wrote a story about dealing with mental health concerns and issues and how a lot of people don't speak up because of comments like Skip Bayless, but he used the Dak Prescott story as his inspiration. And that was really one of my favorites because it solidified to me like why I started my platform is not only just for me to tell stories, but for other people to tell stories that are important to them.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of my favorites as well.
That's awesome. Where can people find it?
People can find it dbltakesports.com. So once again, that's www.dbltakesports.com. Also on social media at dbltakesports.
Awesome. Now with you brought up golf, and I thought that was certainly interesting. One of the things that I know throughout the years, I heard a lot of veteran journalists say a lot of the deals go down on the golf course. um, and like you said, it's not seeing too many Black people. You always hear about the Tiger Woods, then you started hearing about Cheyenne Woods.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Do you see a surge in African American golfers coming, or you think we still have a long way to go?
I do think we still have a long way to go when it comes to like the professional level, like the PGA tour. I mean, getting to the tour is difficult as it is. So I definitely think we have a long way to go as far as that's concerned. But some of these other, like some of these amateur tours and some of these other tours that are out there, I mean, there's a APGA tour, I believe, which is an African American tour. I mean, there's other tours out there that you do see African Americans participating in, and minorities as well. So I don't want to just focus on that, but that's just kind of where my passion lies. So, but I think as a whole, we still have a long way to go in educating people and helping them understand that these other opportunities exist and these other opportunities are out there. Because really, what we do see on TV is the PGA tours and the champion tours. But there's really a lot. I mean, there's executives in golf too, you know, so there's a lot of places that African Americans exist that people don't know about in the golf industry.
Yeah, that's true. As we, before we get out of here, I gotta ask this question. The title of the show is called Breaking Through the Glass Ceiling. When did Miss Carita Parks break through the glass ceiling? When was that moment that you realized, whether it was in public relations or journalism, that you was that damn good at what you do?
That's a really good question. For me, I think it was starting my own business because that's just not, it's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of resilience. You have to be good at what you do. You have to pay attention to a lot of different factors. You have to manage these client relationships, and you have to make sure your business is running well. There's just so many different facets to it. So for me, starting my business and being brave enough to do that and actually being successful at it, and for it to still be doing well to this day, I think that's when I broke through the glass ceiling. It just, believing in myself and just knowing, okay, you can step out on faith and do this, and to see that it's actually worked. And it propelled me into journalism and where I am today. So I have a lot to owe to PR and Parks PR as well.
That's awesome. I love it. Let the people know where they can find you and any parting words you want people to take away from this conversation.
Well, you can find me on all social media platforms at Carita C Parks, and Corrita is spelled Carita. And then, like I said, you can find Double Take Sports at DBL Take Sports. Also, Parks PR at Parks PR on Instagram and such. And really, if I say there's anything I'd like people to take away from this conversation, is just believe in yourself. Life is full of ups and downs, and there will be times where it gets hard. There will be times where you question yourself. There'll be times where you wonder if whatever you're pursuing is your purpose and if you should do it. And my answer is absolutely yes. Just keep going, because that time when you want to quit is more than likely the time where you're almost there. So just don't quit and keep going.
Don't quit and keep going. Corrita, thank you so much for coming on this episode of Breaking Through the Glass Ceilings. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. And, I'm happy that people can get to know what I know, and that you're a great journalist and a great publicist and a great entrepreneur and a great communicator.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen. I know we talked about it a while ago, and I'm
Yeah,
just glad that we finally had a chance to have this
absolutely.
conversation.
Yeah, we're going to have to do it again soon.
Definitely.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I really hope you enjoyed that episode with Miss Carita Parks. She's just an amazing media person. I mean, she literally can do it all. Next week, I bring on a good friend. You could say started from the DMs. Now we here when it comes to networking. A lot of people, you look at the DMs as something bad, but my guest, she and I became good friends because of our mutual passion for baseball and our mutual passion for sports, and that is the one and only Miss Curls and Sports herself, Erica Fernandez. Make sure you tune into that episode. If this is your first time, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Go ahead and drop a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Hit the follow button on all other podcast platforms and share it with your friends. Let me know, what did you think about the episode? Tweet at the guest. That's why the social media handle's there, but don't stalk them. Until the next time, folks, do not let anybody set up a ceiling that you can't break through. This podcast was recorded and edited by B Waters Productions. The music by Hypno Beats. Make sure you follow him at Hypno_beats with a Z on Instagram.